Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week we're talking about texture pastes, commercial as well as homemade, mostly homemade ones. Because a lot of people seem to think that just buying a jar of off-the-shelf commercial grade artists, molding paste, modeling paste, texture pastes, that's too much money for them, so they're just going to make one themselves. But is it worth doing that? Well, I'm here today to present my findings after spending over a year testing multiple batches, multiple recipes. I think I'm finally ready for a definitive answer, so stick around. So what exactly are texture pastes anyway? A texture paste, molding paste, modeling paste, whatever the individual or brand wants to call it, is an acrylic product used to either extend color, add sort of extra texture, or maybe get rid of texture in certain paintings. It can also be used for creating a ground to either draw or paint on in place of gesso. Now when it comes to texture paste, you're going to find a lot of different options from major art supply retailers, like their own house brand, as well as companies like Liquitex and Golden that make simple jars, bottles, buckets sometimes of different kinds of pastes. These pastes are formulated so artists of any level can utilize them and utilize them easily and effectively. They can vary pretty far in terms of overall texture and weight and viscosity and things like that, but the thing you get with any kind of commercial product is a predictable variety, consistency, and viscosity for each of those products. Homemade texture pastes usually rely on household products or possibly some things you can get at the hardware store to make a more comparable product to what you'd get from an art supply company. I found through my research that there's actually no definitive "this is the recipe" for a homemade texture paste. Every artist seems to have their own. A lot of artists don't actually want to share their recipe, and those that do, the recipes are so wild and different between all the different materials or just all the different quantities of materials that finding a distinct recipe was basically impossible. One of the problems with making your own texture paste, though, is that without the factory consistency, things like viscosity, texture, cost effectiveness, and shelf life are all things that are pretty wild variables that just don't really don't have that same control over. Now, with the information of what a texture paste is, let's talk about my experiments here. I was working from the ground up. I went online, I looked at a few different of other people's recipes, found some of their ingredients, some of them that seemed a little bit more problematic than otherwise, but I was like, okay, I gotta find what ingredients to use. The first of these ingredients usually seems to be some sort of a glue. I've actually saw in a lot of videos that regular Elmer's white school glue was used a lot. My problem with school glue is that, at least as a binding agent or as an art material, anything I want to put on canvas, it has a tendency to degrade very quickly over time, as well as create some yellowing as it dries and as it ages. So I'm like, that's not a good option, I think, for artists of any level. I decided to kind of split the difference between a more high industrial like PVA glue from the hardware store and the school glue, and I used some Mod Podge as my glue component. Another thing that was sort of the same across all of the recipes that I found was some sort of an acrylic binding agent. The most common I found was gesso. I got a nice big bucket of gesso. I don't expect you guys to buy a big bucket of gesso to do this, but if you happen to have some around, this is what the most common thing to use for the texture paste was. I will say there's a problem with the gesso, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And the third main component, and fourth would be water, but you don't need a lot of that at all, is whatever the textural component is. Now, I saw a lot of people using baby powder for this. I had a problem with going after using baby powder for this for two reasons. One, at least baby powder sold in the United States currently, after some interesting legal changes, is not talcum powder, it is fragranced cornstarch. Cornstarch, fine, it keeps things dry, but over time, mixed with water, you might run into some issues with mold, so I definitely didn't want to touch baby powder for that. If you could actually get your hands on regular talcum baby powder, That is a cost issue because to buy it in enough bulk and volume for these experiments just was not practical. So in searching more of these ingredients and researching more of the ingredients, the two biggest ones I came across were marble dust, which is what is used in regular molding paste to get it to that consistency, which I actually managed to find a bag of pretty late in this experiment. And the one I was using before that was plaster of Paris. This had some unique challenges in and of itself, which again we'll talk about in just a little bit. But this was sort of the most cost-effective option I could buy at the time. And you can just go to the hardware store and get this. You don't even have to go to an art store. It's actually probably much cheaper to get it at the hardware store. Now, these early tests were very much plaster heavy, and I found that in using plaster, you have the same problems that just like mixing plaster and water together would create, is that it hardens up very quickly. Even when you put it into a jar and try to seal it and save it for later, it just sets and cures in the jar. And especially on a more plaster-heavy mix, once it dries and you try to save it, it just crumbles into dust. Now, the initial applications of those wet batches worked perfectly fine. You know, a little bit of gesso, some plaster, some water, mix that together, get it nice and thick, apply it on canvas, worked really well as long as you were using it quickly and all at once. If you wanted to save it, there was no longevity whatsoever there. After those initial tests, I kind of sat on this video idea for a while and just kind of waited until I had some bit more information. By this point, I also really needed to figure out exactly what factors and variables made a difference. So at this point, I did 3 different batches for both the plaster and the marble dust. This is what I call my 6-cup test. All of these with some plastic over top of them to see how long they last. Obviously, it's a paper cup, so it's a little bit absorbent, but, yeah, you know, factors and things like that. This test was primarily to look at what each of these materials did. These batches I did individually hybrids between glue and gesso, and then just glue and just gesso, and then obviously the variables between the plaster and the dust to see which is better and what all of these things do. The variables and conclusions I pulled out of that stemmed from basically the breakdown of the 4 main components here. The Mod Podge glue added a smoothness and firmness to the overall paste. Gesso brought the longevity and being able to keep it and hold it and cover it in plastic and have it last a while, as well as obviously the white tint. Mixes with plaster created a much thicker impasto and moldability to the paste. And the mixes with the marble dust added a huge amount of stability to the overall mix, as well as it had much better color retention when mixed with paint. From the 6-cup test, I moved on to creating 2 distinct batches which I felt best represented all of these variables and all of these findings. Jar in paste 1 is plaster, jar in paste 2 was the marble dust as the main component. Both of these mixes I gave a fresh sample to on a piece of canvas board, let them dry, see how they did. In doing that, I definitely wanted them to relax and see how long they would last in the jars. I figured I would probably end the experiment early if I noticed one of them or both of them starting to dry in the jars after about a week. Continued to check on them over the course of the weeks, and now it's been about a month and a half, and both are still viable as the day I mixed them in the jars. So we've solved the longevity issue. Then for each of the pastes, I did a variety of tests to see what they looked like both wet and dry and how they accepted color, stuff like that, as well as a cross comparison to regular golden molding paste to see how they compare across the board. The plaster-based paste, because of the size of plaster particles, remained really gritty from initial mix all the way through the resting period and back onto my cardboard tests again. It was just, there's something about the fact that it's the plaster has much thicker, bigger particles. It just, no matter how much you mix it, you can't really get it down. I imagine you could probably hit it with a glass muller, or if you have one of those paint mills or something like that, it would probably break the particles apart a little bit more. But as far as just regular home mixing and swirling it together with a knife in a jar, those particles are really big and remained that gritty texture throughout the course of the test. Interestingly though, once that paste had dried, you could actually brush your fingers across the surface of that and pull a lot of those bigger particles out, leaving just more a I don't want to say smoother surface, but it's a lot less sharp, more or less, with the bigger particles. The thinner brushed applications of this paste dried extremely fast, much faster than just regular traditional molding paste would, but the thicker applications of it took actually the longest to dry of all three. It's definitely less effective for accepting color across the board. When I put a couple of drops of acrylic high flow on them, I noticed the high flow kind of blooming out, and while it mixed into it, it didn't feel like the paste really accepted the color so much as just kind of mixed with it. The rougher texture, though, was actually really cool and pretty great for absorbency. When brushing, when I let it dry and brushed acrylic on top of that, it really grabbed that paint considerably well. It reminded me a little bit of, well, like a plaster molded wall, because it's, you know, plaster based. It was also pretty good for a watercolor overlay. It really kind of grabbed that paint, and I think it could be really interesting to use for a watercolor on plaster kind of look. Now, jar 2, utilizing marble dust instead of plaster as its main component, was better by a very large margin. It looks a little bit grittier. As soon as I was able to kind of spread that around with a knife, it instantly smoothed that out. Honestly, if you're going to compare it to commercial texture paste, this is the one to compare, not the plaster one. It's much, much, much better at accepting paint colors and really tinting the material there. Although because we're using gesso as our acrylic binding agent, it's still going to pastel the color out. That's sort of the downside of using gesso as the binding agent, is because if you're going to do that, it's going to just make it essentially a fancy white paint. One of the tests between all of these was to add a little bit of soft gel gloss to each of the mixes to see how it would intermix with other gels and pastes. Honestly, it looked great in this, and the addition of the extra acrylic into this really helped smooth out the whole batch, and it looks really pretty good. But I would say if you have to add that much acrylic gel or medium into the mix, there's no point in just not getting a commercial jar of whatever you're buying anyway. This batch was also really amazing at overlaying both acrylic as well as pretty much all the dry media and the watercolor. I can actually say in the future, I definitely want to mix some marble dust into gesso because of what I learned out of this, in order to make a more viable ground for dry media or watercolors, perhaps on canvas down the road. So I think in utilizing the marble dust in addition to the gesso, you get a much better ground, again, for all kind of different media. As I just mentioned, with both mixes, the gesso, because it acts like a white, really limits what you can do with the pastes. In theory, you could use a clear gel medium paste or fluid acrylic gel or something like that, but then the cost is going to go a little higher. And once again, if you're buying the acrylic medium anyway to make the homemade paste, just buy the pre-made stuff. Both batches were a little bit thin, and I think in my recipes for both of them that I probably just added too much water. I was adding a little bit here and there, trying to make sure it was coming together as a mix, but I think in the process of doing that, it created a much looser and lower viscosity product. So in that sense, I would say if you're mixing them yourselves, add as little water, if any. Now, of course, the whole point of this is to compare this to what is commercially available already. Now, my go-to in the studio when I'm just looking for a basic texture paste is Golden's molding paste. So that's sort of the control comparison that we're putting everything up against here. Golden's molding paste is notably more transparent. Golden's paste holds knife and brush marks effortlessly. It extends the color with very minimal tinting. And it overlays very well for mixed media, with the one exception of tooth. So Golden's molding paste it dries like acrylic paint would. It dries to a more slick surface. You might think, oh, well, that's where the DIY pastes are better. Well, maybe, but you have to remember that the DIY pastes are using gesso as a component. Gesso is white pigment, it is acrylic polymer, and it's calcium carbonate or chalk. So all I did for this, I was thinking the one place where the overlays didn't work, the dry media smoothed out more, and the watercolor pulled up. It resisted a little bit. But I was thinking about this, and I'm like, the gesso component adds the tooth to the DIY pastes. So if I were to just take a piece of chalk, powder it down, and mix it into the molding paste, it should do the exact same thing, and it did. So watercolor, overlay on molding paste with chalk dust added in, and now it performs like the rest of them. So what exactly are the takeaways here? I spent the better part of like 14 months doing all of these tests, sitting on things, finding new research, trying to figure out how to mix pastes that perform and last. And honestly, that amount of time was completely staggering. I have never spent this long researching a single thing for one video. And bear in mind, as I mentioned at the top of this, there is no definitive recipe, so the vast majority of people making their own homemade DIY texture pastes might be going off of someone else's recipe, but probably are going to find something themselves and something that works more for them, which takes a lot of time and effort to do. And that's time and effort you could be spending just working on your painting and honing your skills. Another huge factor to this, and one that it's the thing people complain about, is cost. A lot of people are like, this is a really expensive jar of stuff. I bet I could make one myself cheaper. Chances are you actually can't. Looking at the bare minimum in volume it would take to do this same experiment, you are looking at, in terms of liquid ingredients, an 8-ounce jar of gesso and an 8-ounce bottle of the Mod Podge. The dust costs roughly $8. The plaster varies a little bit, but if you get the smallest one you can find at the hardware store, you're looking at around $4.50. All of these are US dollars as of 2024, by the way, if you're watching this in the future. All of that together, with a little bit of variables between, like, get the smallest amount you can, you are looking for an equivalent jar, 8-ounce jar, for anywhere between like $19 and $22 US. Meanwhile, the same jar of golden molding paste per Dick Blick's prices in 2024 was just under $12. So you can do it yourself for 20 bucks, or you can buy the heavily tested, very consistent, much better performing product for 12. I'd say that's a no-brainer. In my opinion, after all of this testing, all of these experiments, I can definitively say that there is absolutely no reason on God's green earth that you should ever be making a DIY or homemade texture paste when the commercial product is not only cheaper, more cost-effective, outperforms anything you can make yourself, and has a much, much, much longer shelf life. This is the better product. Go to the store, bite the bullet if it's a cost factor, and get yourself some actual commercially produced acrylic texture paste. It's better on your wallet. You don't need to buy all of this other stuff, because even if you buy all of this other stuff, it's still not cost effective to do it. And remember, $12 is regular retail price. Like, chase the sales, get a coupon. You can probably get it, or don't even get it from Golden. Get the Liquitex one, get a store brand one. They're going to be a lot cheaper than $12. Now, I can already hear you typing away in the comments saying, but Ben, you never told us what your recipes were. What were the ratios? You might have done it completely wrong. I've got more experience in this. You definitely used the wrong ratios. Well, here's the thing. As long as this video has been, the written write-up for this video is way, way, way longer. And that is why I have linked to the Google Docs file in the description box below for all of you guys to check out. It is, including images, around 10 pages of further breakdown and analysis. You can read all about the details behind every single one of these experiments, exactly what I did for each of them, as well as the more rounded out definitive conclusion here. Again, full cost breakdown analysis, all of these experiments, high quality images of all of these things that I showed in the video for you to look at and come to your own conclusion if need be. But that's where all of the information is. This was sort of the overview of everything I've done over the past year, but this has been quite a project, and I'm very happy to be done with it. So, like all of my videos, I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say about this one. What are your thoughts on this? Was this a decent enough experiment? I hope it was, because this took way too long. But I think, at the very least, I would totally stand behind the methods of trial and error and finding out exactly which ingredients do which things. If you're going to make your homemade texture paste, you need to know what you're doing and why. And hopefully this video has saved you any kind of headache of doing it yourself if you were planning on doing so. Now, if you already use a homemade texture paste of any kind and would like to share your recipe, do so in comments below. I really am curious to see what kind of ratios people are using, as well as what materials. As a final footnote, and I hate to even make this a footnote, a lot of this stemmed from the 7-year-old video, Can You Use Joint Compound as Molding Paste? And I'm embarrassed to say that it was so late in this experiment before I realized I probably should have had a third batch of paste that uses the joint compound as the texture component. But that is so far outside of what I want to do at this point that I'm like, nope, we've already made our conclusion. We're not doing this again. We are definitely not doing this again.
We're really not doing this again!
But to supplement that original video, joint compound and molding paste, something that is not in that video is something that I couldn't talk about then because I didn't know then. One, joint compound, as any kind of component, whether you're just using that or mixing with paint, it will break down over time and deteriorate. Two, joint compound does not have the longevity in the tub you buy it in. Over the course of about 4 to 5 years, it will either dry out in the bucket or it will mold. The bucket I had in that video, I had about a quarter of that bucket left and it molded. So, joint compound, not the best use long-term in a studio's environment. Okay, I think that actually covers everything. I'm, again, very happy to be done with this. I hope you guys enjoyed this and learned something. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button. As before, let me know all your thoughts and comments below regarding this topic. Thanks, guys, for watching. Check me out on socials in the description. Socials are also in the description box below, where you can check out my artwork, where I'm using much better paste to make my art. And this has been Cinder Studios reminding you to keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. Oh God, what the fuck am I doing? This was a nightmare.